Thank you. What a great turnout. And today, everyone here is a friend of the library. So thank you for coming and supporting the library. Thank you for Lawrence for ordering me to do this. You know, there's no options. I have to point out, I mean, I'm enormously flattered by the turnout. I also have a friend from elementary school, George and Joanne Russell, who are here, who drove down just for this. And it turns out that I owe him money from elementary school, and but more about that. So I'm going to thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, my background, how I started writing books, and how I think about the books going forward. So first of all, as I said, I want to thank you for coming out to support the Friends of the Library. Earlier this week, I was up in Penn State, actually, for a poetry reading, and I passed by the first library at the Penn State University, which was donated by the very famous Penn State alumnus, Andrew Carnegie. And as many of you know, Andrew Carnegie built 2,500 libraries around the world, the bulk of which were in the United States 100 years ago. And I think that we all, in every way you can think of, we stand on the shoulders who have come before us. The libraries have changed lives. I spent a lot of time in libraries as I grew up. I still do. I love libraries. And so it's a great opportunity for us to continue those kinds of wonderful gifts. So very important, let's continue to support the library. 100 years on, he gave, I think back 100 years ago, it was more than $56 million to create all those libraries. So a little bit about myself first. First of all, I admit to being 77 years old, and I can see by the shock and awe on your faces, you're wondering how I maintain my boyish good looks. My wonderful wife, Ricky, will claim it's her keeping me alive. In fact, we were talking about death the other day, and I said, someday, when I die, I want to be cremated. And she so thoughtfully made an appointment for me for Tuesday. But I just want to tell you my secret, and then we'll move on. And my secret is I very, very carefully chose my parents. My father lived to be 101. My mother in her 90s, and a number of relatives that age. So if you're in a position to do that, that's my advice to you. But also, some people say that just by being around me and coming to these, and most importantly, buying my books, you too can achieve long life. So secondly, and by the way, that means I have another quarter century of bumping people off. So I always wanted to be a writer. And since I was a child, I wrote short stories, and they were horror stories, mostly the things I was afraid of, mummies, zombies. And at the time, of course, growing up, The Twilight Zone was quite a popular series. And I still love that kind of stuff. My favorite writers were people like Isaac Asimov, O. Henry, and Saki, the great short story writer who already wrote With a Twist, and Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch, by the way, wrote Psycho. And there are some echoes of his work in my work as well. In college, I majored in English, but I went on to go to law school because I didn't know how I could survive as a writer unless I became a professor, and that my professors didn't suggest that was a great way of life. But after law school, even though I passed the bar, I actually went into business with my dad, who had a small electronics company selling television tubes and electronic parts. And I was very fortunate because I caught the technology boom over the last 50 years. And that business that my dad had, that was a small electronics business, is now a global entity and we sell primarily connectors, which are devices found on your computer, but mostly in airplanes, cars, and every electronic device that you can think of. I've been fortunate to also participate over the years. The way I kept my hand in it is I was very supportive at Penn State. Because I had no role model when I was there, I sponsor a visiting writer to come every year so that the students can have someone not only to see, but who will work with the students for a week and go over their work with them. So I just came from a week of that up at Penn State, and it's been very satisfying. I never thought that I would get to do a reading of my own. So thank you all for coming. So 6 years ago, I decided during COVID that instead of just drinking heavily to make the time go by, it was suggested to me that there are these, what they call not only remote programs, but low residency programs, where you don't actually have to be on campus more than a week or 10 days every semester. And I enrolled at the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and I had a 2-year program that was just so much fun to be around, not only fiction writers, but also poets and creative nonfiction, people who are primarily writing their memoirs. And as I became more educated and more skilled in my craft, the stories just seemed to come out of me. And my first book, Killer Personality, started life as a short story. And I got to the end of that story and I said, I really like this villain, and I wonder what's going to happen. And in about 20 minutes, I had actually mapped out all the chapters in the book. And I began to write it, and I wrote it within a period of really 2 months, 2 to 3 months. And then I started on the second book, which was linked. You know, Kevin Mather, who is the detective who seems to be a magnet for serial killers. And so I've continued to write these. I've written 8, actually, of which 2 have been published that you see today, and 1 that's coming out in the spring, called Killer Looks, and it's about me, and they all have killer in the title, so everyone will know exactly what they're getting into and not thinking it's a happy children's book. Although you should know that these make wonderful baby gifts, because at some point you do want the children to know about real life. So. Enough about me. Many years ago, when I was single, I dated a narcissist who I went out once. And after talking about herself for an hour, she turned to me and she said, "But enough about me. What do you think about me?" So my childhood favorite villain was Long John Silver, the pirate in Treasure Island. I loved him because he was charming, even when he was making people walk the plank. And I admit to being happy when at the end, spoiler alert, he escapes and is not brought to the hanging post back in England. Another villain who I loved was Macbeth. He listened to the witches and he killed to be king, and then he never had a day of rest, even though he had to keep killing to keep the original crime covered. And of course, my all-time favorite, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a hero and villain in the same body. Such fun. The devil made me do it, you know. And by the way, I started out thinking that Dr. Jekyll was the hero, when in fact he really was not the hero. He was the villain who enjoyed being Mr. Hyde for as long as he could control him. So it's all about shades of gray and not black and white. Another one, of course, a modern one I love Hannibal Lecter. Eat 'em up, Hannibal. And today I will introduce you to Frank, a villain in my third book, who is the villain in Killer Looks. So I want to talk, so villains are a very important part of any book, and when I was studying what makes a good villain, it's not just the craft, it's the three-dimensionality, but also the idea that each of us, even though we are civilized and we are polite, there is a shadow self inside of us, as defined by Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist. And that part of us is not civilized. It wants to come out, and it wants to be bad, and it doesn't want to be civilized. And secretly, in our reading, in the dark of a movie theater, we kind of root for the villain, you know, kill some more, you know, run those numbers up. Are you my people? Or, you know, anyway, that part of us is interesting to me. So my books are not really whodunits. My books are whydunits. What makes these people the way they are? And I'm quite serious about it, and I try to think about that. A second factor I just want to talk about, and I'm going to give you an example of, is the place of Philadelphia, a place as another character in my books. Philadelphia is the place I grew up and I live. The architecture, the personality of the city are key elements that enter into my own identity, my own personality, and my own characters. and I'm going to read a little bit from Killer Urge about the importance of Philadelphia in my story. Now, I want to talk lastly about the hero, because you got to have a hero, right? Because the hero's job is to be the counterpoint against the villain, and they're supposed to fight against each other to keep each other from getting what the other one wants. Kevin Mather is my hero who lives throughout the series. It is he who sees terrible things, and he suffers terrible wounds, both psychological and physical. There's much unfairness in life, and even more in who death chooses to take by violence. Kevin may be a hero, but he suffers and he bleeds and he has doubts, like each of us. It's my job as the writer to show both the villain and Kevin as human beings who progress with their understanding in the book. And as he lives a life where he's exposed to cruelty, kindness, unfairness, and yes, love, just like each of us in our own lives. But hopefully, none of us here are serial killers. I'm very proud of saying that by day, I am a technology leader, and by night, I am a serial killer writer, okay? So we all love our heroes, we love our villains, and may the best always win. Again, I want to thank the Friends of the Free Library for allowing me to read tonight. I hope each of you enjoy my books and are surprised by the twists and turns. If you like my books, I did everything. It was all my idea. If you hate my books, blame it on the Dallas Cowboys, who every proper Philly person hates, okay? I want to read to you a little bit about place. So this is from the current book, Killer Urge, and I have a wonderful character who I like a lot by the name of Anna Cohen, and she is having a phone conversation with her son, and her adult son, and it's not going well. Not that that would ever happen to any of us in this room. Where's my son, Eli? Yeah, I was thinking about you when I wrote this. Okay, here we go. Feeling the need for physical activity, she grabbed her hat and walking stick and exited the tidy 3-bedroom row house in Roxborough. She would take a long walk to clear her mind. Just before going out the door, she thought to put on her windbreaker because it was a bit cool outside. Anna headed for her favorite destination, the Henry Avenue Bridge, which is not far from her house. The beautiful bridge was almost 100 years old, and Anna regarded it as her bridge. It was also known as the Wissahickon Memorial Bridge, having been renamed as such after World War I. She knew much of the history and had researched it in the public library, perusing the plans of the acclaimed Philadelphia architect Paul Philippe Crête. She knew all the statistics of the bridge and could quote them at will. Anna always counted her steps as she crossed the 333-foot-long bridge. She loved the beauty of the arch span and the magnificent view of Lincoln Drive and the Wissahickon River that flowed 170 feet below. Looking down, she could see other historic landmarks in the park, such as the Hermit Lane Bridge and the spot where director Brian De Palma filmed Blowout, starring John Travolta. The bridge, her bridge, had been put on the National Register of Historic Places in 1988. Today, after the disturbing conversation with her son, she crossed the bridge quickly, only slowing at the halfway point so that she could count her steps. It was probably her imagination, but she felt that as she slowed her pace, her heart slowed as the beauty of the sweeping panorama calmed her. She liked to stop partway across and think of the quirky history of the bridge. She had learned that in the 1940s, there was a policeman patrolling the bridge who would question pedestrians walking across. She read that the bridge had also been known as Suicide Bridge for the people who threw themselves off to end their lives. She had spent her whole life in the area, and even as a child, she heard whispered tales of girls and boys who jumped to their deaths because of the pain of a broken heart. She could never discover whether the stories were true, but they added to her love of the bridge, of her bridge. Now that she was older, she occasionally thought it wouldn't be so bad to end her life that way, flying through the air with the certainty of an eternal landing. But not today. Today she had things to worry about and words of wisdom to find to convey to her son about his situation. Midway across the bridge, Anna stopped and looked out at the panorama of Fairmount Park that she also loved. It was particularly beautiful today because of the pristine blue sky and lack of smog in the air. It was a bit chilly and her hands moved unconsciously to the pockets of her windbreaker. She felt the weight in the right pocket and smiled. She reached in and took out the small binoculars she kept for bird watching. She had forgotten that they were there. She put the binoculars up to her eyes and looked out across the landscape below. The strong lenses were always disorienting at first. She sought out the landmark of the stone bridge over the Wissahickon stream and then moved upwards to the summit of the hills, enjoying the diversity of the landscape. There were birds everywhere this time of year: cardinals, warblers, jays, and woodpeckers. She casually moved the binoculars across the landscape, looking for the birds in the trees and aloft. Finding and identifying the different species of birds soothed her, relaxed her, calmed her. Then she saw movement among the trees at the summit. There were two indistinct figures in her lenses. Both were seated. As she watched, one of the figures suddenly reached down for a large rock, stood up, and brought it down hard on the head of a seated figure. After a moment, the standing person hit the now lying figure again with such force that Anna herself recoiled and dropped the binoculars, which fortunately were on a strap around her neck. She fumbled for the glasses with shaking hands and put them to her eyes, struggling to find the two figures again. She scanned the hill and couldn't seem to locate the spot where the terrible scene had unfolded. "Come on, come on, come on," she muttered with rising anxiety. At last, she found the right spot. But now there was only one figure lying on the ground, unmoving. The standing figure was walking away calmly as if nothing had happened. Anna focused the glasses for a closer look at the fallen one and saw the broken and deformed skull covered with blood. The figure was still. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. She dropped the glasses, and the scene below returned to the panorama of trees and paths and small byways through the forest. It seemed impossible that she had seen what she had seen. She picked up the glasses again and immediately found the fallen and broken person on the ground. No, this was real. So that's, thank you. So just a comment. The city is a place where people live and die, and it has to be integrated into the story and into the action, and not just something that's descriptive and never plays a role again. And that's true about people. If you introduce a character, I mean, there's a saying, I don't know if it was Chekhov who said, if you introduce a revolver in Act 1, it has to go off by Act 2. So the things that are in the book, including the place, has to add to the value and the enjoyment of the book. And I got a number of calls from people I used to run with through Valley Green, and they're like, this is so creepy, you know. So anyway, okay, I'd like to do two other readings, and then I'll take some questions. I'm going to introduce you to the villain in book 3. This is from the book, and by the way, I always have at the end of my books the first chapter of the next book, in the effort to hook you and get your money. So, as you know, most writers don't make much money, so this is not about money, but I want people to read the books and enjoy them. Okay, this is from Killer Looks, the note writer. I know that I am handsome. All my life, I have gotten attention for my looks from both men and women. I have never had difficulty finding a partner for sex or even for a relationship, but my relationships never last, and I have stopped trying. After all, looks go just so far. This is the downside of being handsome on the outside and dull on the inside. But when people first meet me, doors always open. I am particularly good with older women. They like me. They like talking to me, touching me, my hair and my skin, especially my skin. They tell me they love my soft skin, and they like me touching them until they don't. I have been doing this for so long that it is almost too easy. Still, there is that special moment when my victims know that they are in terrible peril, and I feel my heart leap. Then all too soon, it's over. And when it's over, the old dissatisfaction returns. Who would have thought that killing would get stale? Maybe I need to pick different kinds of victims who pose more of a challenge. The fact is that I am bored. I need something different to spice up my hobby. Actually, it is more than a hobby. It's my life's work. The answer came to me when I was reading the newspaper one night before bedtime. A serial killer had been caught in my very own hometown of Philadelphia. But what got my attention was the fact that the man who caught the killer had previously caught another serial killer. That man's name was Kevin Mather. Now this was interesting. My mother always said that anyone can do something once, but if you do it a second time, it is not by accident. I clipped out the article and put it by my bedside where it stayed for several months. As time went by, I saw other articles about Kevin Mather that I clipped out. At some point, I knew everything there was to know about Kevin that was in the public domain. I supplemented this information with what I could find about Kevin on the internet. This man interested me and stirred my thoughts more than anyone had in a long time. I had an idea that had been brewing inside me. I was thinking of sending Kevin a message, a fan letter from one professional to another. After all, in one of life's coincidences, I had known Kevin before he became what he was and before I became what I am. As it happened, a few days later, I was with a lovely older woman whose name was Martha or Mildred or something like that. We had met in the park and she invited me home for coffee. She lived in a nice house not far from the park. Under other circumstances, I might have seen her more than once, but as it was, I was thinking about how to send a note to Kevin that he would be compelled to read and respond to. I asked my new companion if she would write a short letter for me on her computer and then print it. Of course she agreed to do it. As she typed, I looked over her shoulder and leaned in close, making sure she could feel my breath on her neck. "When I'm done being your secretary, will you do something for me?" she had asked playfully. She had been flirting with me from the moment I had sat down on the park bench near her. I continued to dictate the letter, something nonsensical just to see how she used the keyboard. I knew she was thinking about collecting her fee for her secretarial work. Close behind her, teasing her, I wanted her to think about me, about kissing me, and more. I caressed the back of her neck as she typed. I stroked her skin and she squirmed under my touch. It was amusing. I finished dictating and asked her to print the note I had dictated. I watched carefully as she hit the print button and there was the noise of the printer starting up. Now I knew exactly how to work her printer for the real letter I intended to type myself. After. Before she could take the paper from the printer and close the computer, I kissed the back of her neck, leaning over her from behind. I kissed her at the base of her neck, below where her hair was tied up in a knot. She shivered beneath my touch, and I smiled to myself. I kissed her again, and my hands moved to my pockets and took out the gloves. I continued kissing her neck while I prepared to straighten up, the gloves on my hands. She leaned back into me and looked up, a smile on her face. I could tell she was anticipating what was coming next. Me too. She revolved her chair to face me, and I was ready, my hands moving surely to her throat, knowing exactly what to do, how hard to squeeze to keep her quiet while making the feeling last. When too soon it was over, I typed the real letter, printed it, and left it on the keyboard in front of Mildred or Martha or whoever she had been. The letter read, "Dear Kevin Mather, you don't know me, but I am a fan who has admired your work in catching not one, but 2 serial killers. I understand you did this at great personal expense. My sympathies for your losses. But on the positive side, you now have the experience you need to match wits with an experienced and so far undetected serial killer. That would be me, of course. If you are reading this letter, then you know that I am indeed whom I say I am, given that this letter was found with my most recent victim. Would it pique your interest to know that she is my lucky 13th victim? But things have become a bit stale for me and I need a new challenge. How about this offer of engagement? If you agree to try to catch me, I will slow down my killing to play our game. If you do not agree, I will accelerate my activities and I will leave a note to you and to the newspapers at each fresh kill. So as some famous killer once wrote on a wall, stop me before I kill again. I double dare you. My most esteemed colleague, if you accept my challenge, please put an ad in the Friday classified ads at the Inquirer that precisely says this: to my friend, the note writer, game on. Kevin, my friend, if you accept, more clues will follow and we will have lots of fun. Gosh, I am so excited. Can Kevin come out and play? Your pal, the note writer. So I was taught rigorously in my creative writing program that I had to get into in page 1, paragraph 1, the scene. I had to have the tension, and I had to set up, what was going to happen in the rest of the book. And the other thing that's really important is what we call a ticking clock. There has to be a ticking clock. Get back to me by Friday, or else do this, or else. So those were some craft elements, but the character, I have to admit, I love this character because he's so bad. The third reading I wanted to do, I wanted to introduce you to Kevin, and the hero. In this reading, this is from not book 1, but book 2. And Kevin has really suffered here. He has caught these serial killers. He's been severely wounded. He's had people taken from him, and he is a mess. He's terribly depressed. In my books, every character speaks in the first person because it was easier for me to put myself into them as opposed to being a universal narrator. This way, everyone can say what they know, even if what they know is not everything to be known. And by putting all the characters together, you have to read them all, and that's how you get the story. This is, again, from Killer Urge. And so the note comes into the police, and the chief of police is a guy by the name of Leonard. And Leonard is actually Kevin's best friend. And so this little part starts with Leonard and the note. I was holding a copy of the note in my hand. It wasn't like I had a lot of options. If we didn't accept the challenge in the newspaper specified, the note writer would kill again. We had to take this clown seriously because the letter was on the body of a victim. He or she was the real deal. It had to be a he for sure. Of course, I had used this reasoning before. I had used this reasoning before I found out about female serial killers. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, but I needed Kevin. I decided to speak to, I left out one important thing. So Kevin is going to a therapist who deals with PTSD, and he handles a lot of police officers and military personnel who've been through war. And Leonard sent Kevin to see this therapist. I decided, this is Leonard again, I needed to speak to Lou, to Dr. Lou, who could break confidentiality given the life and death situation. I was right about that, which was why when Kevin walked into his appointment to see Dr. Lou, he found me there as well. When Kevin saw me, his face dropped. I felt like a fucking Judas. This was supposed to be his safe place where he could open himself up and let out the poison and shit that he had soaked up in his hunt for 2 stone murderers. And here I was, his best friend, invading his safe place. I invade people's space all the time. I go to the front door of a home that is happy until I arrive. Then I tell people who live there that their loved one isn't coming home, has been murdered, shot, stabbed, run over, poisoned. I tell people the worst thing that they will ever hear in their lives. So yes, I know how to do what I was doing. The difference is that I was doing it to my best friend in the world. I handed Kevin the letter. Kevin. When I walked in and saw Leonard sitting there, I was stunned. I didn't understand what it meant. He stood up and handed me something. I sat down holding the paper in my hand. I was thinking that this was something different. Every single morning I got up and was immediately enveloped in a dark cloud that I knew was depression and hopelessness. Everyone who was dead the night before was still dead. I was still the serial killer magnet, and people were dead because of me. Some people were alive because of me, this was true, but that didn't change the other things I couldn't escape. And this letter, handed to me by my best friend, no less, in my shrink's office. I read the letter all the way through and turned over the last page to make sure I had read it all. I looked up. Leonard and Dr. Lou were looking at me expectantly. Did they expect a blow-up, an explosion of anger or sorrow? But the reverse was true. The part of my mind that had been frozen, the part that told me to do this and do that proactively, I felt the gears begin turning again. I said, obviously we have to answer this or someone will die. Both men nodded at me, still watching, waiting. If Leonard hadn't been there, I might have talked to Dr. Lou about what I was feeling. I trusted Dr. Lou, even if I didn't trust myself. But I didn't want Leonard to see me like this, to see what I was really thinking and feeling. What I was feeling was happy. It was so clear to me, so sweet. I hadn't felt anything in months except sadness and hopelessness. And then I wondered if I were a terrible person for feeling happy. But I did feel happy. Suddenly, unexpectedly, I had a purpose. The universe needed me, and I had shit to do. I didn't smile, even though I felt like smiling. So you've now met the city, you've met Kevin, and you've met one of my villains. I always start my books with a villain. If I have a villain, I'm in good shape, and then we can figure out what to do. I could read some more, but I would like to answer some questions. Does anybody have any questions about my boyish good looks, or what would you like to know, if anything?
Thanks so much for hosting this today. Congratulations on your second book. You said that you are really interested in getting into the minds of the killers and understanding why they're doing these things. Can you walk us through a little bit about what your research for this is like? Do you do
Well, I thought about killing my kids, okay? And Ricky knows that I have killed her many times. I've done a little bit of reading, but I'm not a therapist. I think that I actually did more research into how homicide detectives and people who were involved with death come to feel about it. And it's similar to surgeons who have to be able to operate and forget about their mistakes. In the books, I create a community within the homicide department because they are, not only do their lives really depend upon each other, but nobody else understands what they're going through. I've read other people's books, but I find them two-dimensional when it comes to these bad guys. And rather than try to come at it from a psychological point of view, because I'm not a psychiatrist, I tried to figure out what kind of events would shape a normal person to become an abnormal person. I tried to think about that a lot. And I'm sure that everybody in this room has wondered, why did someone take one path and someone take another path? Why did someone react in a way? I always think that when I'm on an airplane and somebody's crazy on the airplane, it's like, why are you acting? I feel the same way you do, but I'm not going to do that. So I wouldn't say that I've really done any proper research. I've read a lot of murder mysteries. I find most of them to be, one-dimensional. I don't find that not that they don't give the killer credit, but they don't look at them as a person who chose to be a certain way, and why they did that. I have a character in book one who does not out of pleasure the way the one I read to you. This person doesn't kill out of pleasure. They feel they kill out of necessity, that they have to erase that person, and so they do. They erase them. Where you and I would move, you and I would break up with the person. Breaking up with this person is hard to do. That's all I'm going to say. So no, I don't really do. I'm not a psychiatrist. I just try to see if it makes sense to me, but try to make them as human as I can make them. And so that you'll say, I kind of understand and I feel some sympathy for their situation. I wouldn't do that. But the truth is, we don't want to read about a day at the beach. We want to read something awful, right? We want to read, people behaving badly. That's what we want to see. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I also read a lot about I was very interested in the police side of it and how the death affects them. And I really thought a lot about Leonard having to go to house after house to tell people. And he suffers a lot. And he tells everyone that if I didn't suffer, I couldn't do my job. I need to suffer. I don't want to suffer, but I need to feel. And so, I tried to think that through and try to find it in other books. So.
How do you sleep at night? And more importantly, how does your wife sleep at night? Is this your book
title is Killer Urge. Is this urge toward the macabre something that you kind of have to, are you purging demons? Are you managing? Are you, what is it about your personality?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I originally wrote it, and I've read that Stephen King, says these things. Not comparing myself to Stephen King, but he's been scaring me for 50 years, and I mean, yeah, I think we write because we're afraid of things, and we want to write it so that it comes out a certain way where we're not injured. But I have memories of going to my first overnight camp when I was 10 years old, and I was terrified to go by myself down to the lake, and because it was through the trees, it was through the forest, and I had all these, I was fearful, and my fearfulness knew no bounds, and sort of, it's sort of, if you think about, Jaws, the movie, the story was they couldn't get the thing to work, between the music, but not seeing much of the creature, it creates much more fear. I was always afraid. I was sure that something was going to get me. I didn't even feel, I mean, after I saw the movie Psycho, people my age, I don't think I took a shower for 10 years. I was like, who's going to come and kill me in the shower? It could happen anywhere. So I think but the second part of the question is, I'm not really, well, my wife might say, but I don't think I'm that neurotic. I think writing about it makes me feel better. The world is not fair on a lot of levels, and it's particularly unfair when somebody kills somebody. I mean, it's one thing for a natural disaster to happen. The natural disaster is not personal, it's happening, it's just happening. But when somebody does something bad, it's very personal. And we care about it. If I can make you care about the characters, then you'll care when something bad happens to them. And it has to make sense in the story. It can't be gratuitous violence. I mean, I don't really want to write about the terrible details, but sometimes I do, because otherwise it's not real. It has to be real to you in some way. So yeah, it makes me feel better to write about these things, and and they're just things to think about, and I like to think about them, and we all like to be scared. I don't ride roller coasters because they scare the daylights out of me, but some people like. I mean, why would you pay money to get the shit scared? I'm going to be the guy writing about the roller coaster that, where a crazed maintenance guy, loosens a bolt. That's my kind of stuff. So, plus, I think there's one other element. I don't know if this is, whenever I see somebody who has a cast on their arm, I say, what happened? They say, oh, I fell. I said, not good enough. What you got to do is say, you were in a bank, and the robbers, that's much more interesting, and that's what I try to do. I try to say, okay, what would be interesting? What would interest me? But I do turn on the alarm, and I have 3 little dogs who guard me. I used to have 3 little dogs.
You said earlier that when you started to think about writing, you plotted out in your head what the chapters were going to be. Did you ever find when you actually started writing the book that it took you in a direction that you hadn't anticipated, that the book started to write for you and you found you had to go a different way?
Yeah, that's actually really good. Did everybody hear what Mike said? Did I find when I did an outline that I would go a different way? So my outline was never about what the character was going to do. My outline was what happens when Kevin goes to Florida. And what would happen to me, I'd have Kevin go to Florida, and I go, no, that's not going to, that's not going to work. I have to have him do something else. So directionally, it would be right. But when I started to write it, the characters would decide what to do. Or if you're thinking through what someone's doing, you're saying, well, it wouldn't make sense. They're not going to drive overnight from Philadelphia to Miami. They got to stop someplace. What happens when they stop someplace? And how does if a character is good with a gun, how did they get to be good with a gun? So I have to make up a backstory of how they got to be good with a gun, So, but directionally, you try to move your characters around and then bring them together someplace where something bad is going to happen that's interesting. Doesn't mean I know who's going to survive. Doesn't mean I know what that bad thing is going to be. But directionally, everything is about action and motion. So, okay, if this person is not going to die at the end of the chapter, what's going to happen to them? How do they get away? So I got to create that. And where are they going to go? And when they go there, what are they going to do? So in each place, and it has to be true to the character. Is this making sense to everybody? So to create a story, you have to say, well, what happens next? So I'm always saying, well, what's going to happen next? What would they do? What is the note writer going to do? And by the way, I have to confess, I don't tell you everything. There's shit that I know that you're not going to know until it's time for you to know it. Just like life, right? So, and it can't be what they call Deus ex machina. Do you know what that is? It can't be like at the last minute somebody swoops in from the sky and they lift you up and you don't get bitten by the shark. No. It has to be something that's logical, that you were prepared for, that in chapter 1 you missed it.
Since I was introduced to killer urge today and knew nothing about killer personality, is it your opinion that you should read killer personality before killer urge?
No, because I've tried to, the characters are complete, and the stories are not dependent upon each other. You can step into any part of it and be fine. I do think that you probably should read, before you get further on in the series, you probably should read them. And you should probably buy at least 100 copies of each. Remember the baby gift, bar mitzvahs, weddings? No, but I've tried to make sure, because that always is frustrating to me. I tried to give out the information in each book to make them insular so that the reader would know why they were there. It's enough to know that Kevin in book 2 has suffered a lot in book 1, or in book 3, the same kind of thing.
Which serial killers in real lives intrigue you the most?
That's a really good question. I mean, none of them are my heroes. I mean, I'll tell you which ones don't intrigue me. The ones who don't intrigue me are ones who were so bizarre that I can't identify with them in any way. There was one whose name I don't remember, but he had a barbecue stand where he sold sort of human flesh, So that didn't really appeal to me, that much, because I eat a lot of barbecue when I go to Texas. So, I guess I gotta think about that, because let me come back to you.
You started you started your world in your life doing other things. School, working in business, and later on now, in this next phase of life, we all go through phases. You decided that you could do this, but you made a choice to go back to education, right? Talk to me about that. Explain why.
Well, I always loved reading, and I always loved writing, and I thought I was a pretty good writer, but I didn't, like a lot of people, I'd say, well, I got to wait for the best, I got to have an idea, I got to know what I'm going to do fully hatched before I do it. And I'd written a number of stories, but I didn't really know the concept of how to start it, what the middle should look like, in the end. And so in between, 30 years ago, one of the things I thought that I could do to help the English department at Penn State was I sponsored a visiting writer. And so the first visiting writer came up and was this terrific writer by the name of Mary Carr, who some of you may have heard of, who's a memoirist. And she was charming and interesting, and she gave this wonderful reading, and then she left. And I said, that's not what I want. I want somebody who's going to come for a week and spend a week with the students, because they need a role model. And I didn't have a role model, and it's one of the reasons I didn't become a writer. So the English department was great. They pivoted, and they started bringing these fabulous poets and writers, just terrific, who loved the kids, but were basically loved teaching. And I would go up for the class, and I would go up for the reading, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed hearing from the students that they got their work critiqued, but also at the same time, a student wants to say, well, how did you do it? And when there was a guy, Jess Walter, who wrote a beautiful book called The Beautiful Ruins about Italy, great writer. And he said, here I am, a single dad living in upstate New York, and I'm a crime writer on a crappy newspaper, and I'm a single dad, and my refrigerator is covered with rejection slips. And I wrote every day, and I was a failure until I wasn't. And then, and he goes on, and people need to hear that. And I had to make a living, I had to this, but I wrote every day, and that's my advice to you. And that's what I tell everybody. If you're going to write, you write every day. So when I went back to school, I can sort of tell this. It was during COVID, and I had all these feelings, and I had a lot of anger, and I was writing some angry stories, about people doing bad things in New Hope, and I can't tell this whole story, but I saw someone who had lost a family member, and the way they looked, I wanted to be able to explain that. I wanted to be able to portray what I was seeing, which was this sadness sort of emanating from every pore that was not staged and it was not meant for anybody's benefit. And I wanted to be able to do that. And so I was very fortunate. I had written a story, and I sent the story to the Penn State head of the English department. I said, listen, I want to critique. I'll still give you money, but I need to know the truth. And he said, it's good, but it's not good enough, and you need to go back to school. And Ricky said, okay, you should do it. This is it. Take your moment. And I was trying to figure out how I could spend 20 hours a week and still run the company that I was running. And I decided I was going to do it. And I started writing every morning, like 6:30 to 8:30. And I discovered in the coursework that I didn't have to have the whole idea. I just had to have the beginning. Not even the plot. I had to have a character. And sometimes I just said, okay, I got this empty page. I'm just going to start writing. And I started writing about this woman I had seen. How can I describe what I saw? I don't know if there's a story there. And then, of course, I said to myself, if she's that sad, what's the story that made her sad? And of course, in writing, you don't say, oh, she was sad because she lost this person. You show it. You don't tell it. You show it. And then that forces you to build these believable characters, and suddenly you're writing a very long backstory that may have nothing to do with, or has everything to do with where you're going, but it becomes more important. So for example, when I started to be dedicated to trying to create three-dimensional characters, I wrote a backstory. I wrote a biography of this character. And I said, okay, who are they? And some of it I would use, and some of it I didn't use. And so suddenly I felt that I was able to create these worlds, not even, and here's what's important, you don't have to have it spring into your head fully born. You just have to start with something that you want to do, and then let your unconscious take over. I mean, I have lived, a long time. I know more than I knew when I was a student. And so I draw on those things. Nobody is in the book as they are. They're all composites of other people. And by the way, if you're mean to me, you're going in the book, okay? Either as a killer or as a killee. So that's kind of the story.
Do you or one of your villains have a favorite way of killing?
That's a really good question. I'm kind of squeamish, but I think my answer to that is the situation that they're involved in. And sometimes people deserve the worst. And I try to figure out what is the worst thing that would be just for this person. And I have to match it up with what the capability of the character is. I don't know anything about guns. I do all this research online. I don't even like guns. One of my classmates was like a gun guy. So I'd call him up and say, could you make a shot from across the street, in this? And, oh, yeah, it'd be an easy shot. It's like, okay, if you say so. But mostly I think about why someone would be motivated to use a particular weapon. Why is somebody going to use a knife? A knife is messy and personal and up close. A gun is less personal. Does the gun have to be a silenced gun? You know, is that important? And sometimes people will display the body in a way designed to create horror because that's what they want to create. That's the effect that they want. So it's not only the killing, it's like, what is the killer trying to accomplish? Some killers just want to erase. I don't care. I want you gone. 50 ways to leave your lover. I don't care how you go. I don't care whether I'm going to shoot you or stab you. I just want you dead.
So in your process, have you experienced writer's block, and if so, how did you overcome it?
I have experienced writer's block to the same extent that I experience fear of speaking to people, which is never. I never had writer's block. Even if I write for 15 minutes, I sit down and I'm going to come away with something. But sometimes when I go to write something that I know is really hard, that I don't know how to write it, I just have to start. And even if what I'm going to write I'm going to discard, it's helpful to me to write it. So I have a story, I have a memoir that I'm writing that I thought was originally about my mother had a lot of stories, and my mother was wonderful in a lot of ways. And you get to a certain age and you say, not the road not taken, but why am I the way I am, and why am I not some other way? And so my mother and my grandparents and her older brother were in 1918 were in a car accident where their car was hit by a train at a very dangerous crossing in Ohio, and her older brother was killed. And then the family went on to have two other sons, and one of those sons was the replacement child, and he was the golden child, and the other one was not. And they went on to live a particular way, and it was almost like the ripples in the pond. And I started thinking about that, and I also thought a lot about the fact that my mother had survived and had a lot of guilt about why she survived and not her brother. And there was a lot of, people didn't know anything about post-traumatic shock syndrome. People didn't know that these things can haunt you for your whole life. And so I was very interested, and I became even more interested when I interviewed people in the family who had a different take on the story, where my mother was sitting, where her brother was sitting, how it was. And so I have become very interested, not in the truth, because there is no truth. I went back there, I did research, I pulled up all the newspaper articles. I had somebody in the Historical Society. There's some point where you don't really know what happened, but I do know how people thought about what happened, and that is more interesting to me. So I'm trying to write that, and I'm struggling hard to write it because I wasn't there. So I'm putting words in people's mouths. I'm putting two emotions that I knew existed, and in some cases I create a character as an outside third person to try to tell the story. Because in the end, it's my story, and I'm going to tell it the way I want to tell it, and I need to tell it because it bothers me. I don't know why, but if I do a good job, it'll bother you too. I'm really serious. And so, I think that if you're looking for perfection, that's not going to help you be a writer. If you're going to do good research, but also let your psyche take over, whether it's left brain, right brain, you let your emotions, they won't ever steer you wrong. If you feel a certain way, that's how you feel. And I'm at the age where I'm interested in why do we feel this way, and what did we do with that story? What did we do with that story? So I'm a storyteller, and my mother was a storyteller, and I really think stories are powerful. And we use them in our families, we use them in our morality. I spent a lot of time in Italy. If you look at go into the churches before people could read and write, on the floors and on the walls, all the Bible stories are told in pictures. the architecture. I think that when they wrote Victor Hugo wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, he wrote about it and talked about the story of everything. And by the way, only priests could read, so the books. So the architecture reflected these histories, whether they were the mosaics of the Bible stories, they were meant to awe you, they were meant to be, but stories are how we interact with the world, and it's why architecture is not just architecture. It's really, really important. It says a lot about who we are.
You're done.
I'm done. Okay, thank you.